Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 6 of Mass Communication 100. I hope you guys felt comfortable with the exam from week 5. The exams are going to be very similar and they are not cumulative. So exam 2 will begin with newspapers and run through the material that we cover until exam 2. I will be trying to grade exam 1 here in the next week or so, so you should have those grades back fairly quickly. If you have any questions about the exam or your grades, any performance questions, please feel free to contact me. I'm happy to discuss that with you at any time. Until I get those grades back to you for the exam 1, we can begin our next lesson, which is on chapter 8. It's newspapers, the rise and decline of modern journalism. In this video, we'll focus on part 1, which is the history of the printed press. Now, newspapers are a large part of American culture. Even if you don't physically pick up a newspaper every day, they still have a large influence on who we are as a society, our cultural values, and things like that. This edition of the New York Times was just published recently with the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and it's one of those iconic front pages that will go down as one of the historical moments of the paper just because of the wide sweeping impact of that event. And we can point to many different periods in history that papers have really been able to capture through their front page in a chronicle of what American life is like. Now, it doesn't have to be major events that newspapers chronicle. In fact, if you do historical research through newspapers, you can see all different types of coverage and see the patterns that our culture shapes and kind of moves as the coverage of newspapers changes over time. Now, newspapers are meant to both inform and entertain. They do shape cultural trends within our country. Newspapers often can act as government watchdogs within the American journalism structure. They can trigger debates about important topics. They can offer advice in columns like Dear Abby, or even make us laugh with comics, which can be both funny and political, of course. And they really set the agenda for what we consider important in our lives. And so one theoretical scholar actually talks about newspapers as a ritualization of culture. Think just back 10 years ago with me when your parents, or maybe even you at a younger age, would get the morning paper. Your parents might sit down at the kitchen table, have their coffee, and take in the news and information. While other people in their homes were doing the exact same thing in the exact same ritualized way. Really, that is how culture became ritualized in our country for a very long time, because the same people were taking in the same kinds of information at the same time of day, and it became this ritual that we all became part of. Now, as the industry has changed, that certainly has shifted and changed as well. But even the current digital and mobile models of journalism really owe their heritage to newspapers, because newspapers were one of the first forms of journalism within America. So it's important to look back at the history so we can know where journalism is today. Now, the first written news that we are aware of historically was developed by Julius Caesar, and it was actually a public post in 59 BC that just gave the information of the time of what was happening in Rome. And so this is our first knowledge of written communication, but of course, this isn't what we would consider mass media, because just one written news plaque is not enough to get around to a large amount of people. So instead, we can look at American journalism, and the first North American newspaper was actually the Public Occurrences, both foreign and domestic, in 1690. It was published in Boston by Ben Harris, and it was very short-lived. In fact, it was banned after just one issue because the newspaper took a negative tone towards the British rule and printed a very scandalous story about Francis King having an affair. And so it was a very short-lived publication, but one that would kind of set the stage for American journalism. In 1704, the first regularly published paper began. The Boston Newsletter was published by John Campbell. It was mainly filled with dull news of what happened in Europe the month prior, but it was able to communicate those events to a larger public. In terms of local news, they might cover illnesses, public floggings, suicides, things like that, but it was primarily news from Europe that was over a month old by the time it had been published. In 1721, we have two brothers who really create some of the most memorable colonial newspapers, the New England Courant in Boston, which was produced by Ben Franklin's older brother, James. These stories were some of the first to appeal to ordinary readers. Instead of really writing for high class, affluent leaders in our country, the New England Courant was really written for the everyday man. In 1729, Ben got a little sibling rivalry and decided to start his own paper, the Pennsylvania Gazette. And historians consider this the best colonial newspaper because of its ability to go out and report original news. It's really one of the key examples of how American early journalism really shaped the way that we think of journalism today. It was also one of the first to include advertising for products within a newspaper in order to create revenue for the product. And the newspaper also took subsidies from political parties, which meant that they really could not anger the members of the political parties that they were taking money from. In 1733, the New York Weekly Journal was printed by John Peter Zenger. It was with the Popular Party, and it opposed British rule, and so it was a key part of the American Revolution. In 1734, Zenger was actually arrested for criticizing the royal governor of New York. He was arrested and charged with seditious libel, which libel is defaming a public official's character in print. Zenger's lawyer was Andrew Hamilton, you may know of him, and the verdict was in that American newspapers have the right to criticize government leaders as long as the reports are true. And so it was really the basis for the First Amendment, which of course was passed in 1791. So you can see how these early cases of American legal journalism cases were able to kind of shape the way that the press was able to work in the legal system later on. Here's a rendering of the courtroom, and I think Hamilton's concluding remarks kind of set the tone for what journalism was meant to look like in America. The question before the court and you, gentlemen of the jury, is not of small or private concern. It is not the cause of one poor printer, nor of New York alone, which you are now trying. No, it may, in its consequence, affect every free man that lives under a British government on the main of America. It is the best cause. It is the cause of liberty. And this, again, kind of points to the idea that journalism in America was meant to point to freedom. It was created on the basis of a free press even before we were officially formed as a nation. Now, early newspapers, there were very few in the beginning, of course. In 1765, there were 30 papers in the colonies. It wasn't until 1784 that we get our first daily paper. And the largest of these papers only had a circulation of 1,500 people. The readership tended to be very wealthy people who were interested in politics or business. And there were really two types of press. The first was the partisan press, and the agenda of those journalists was for whomever was paying the bills. It was for the party that would subsidize the paper. And this kind of is what the editorial system of modern journalism is based on, this partisan press. Commercial press, on the other hand, was focused on business leaders who were interested in economics, and this really created a lot of the business journalism that we see today. Now, the penny press was really a turning point in American journalism history. In the late 1820s, a paper cost about 6 cents, and a yearly subscription would be about $10 or $12, which was a week's salary for most people. So, newspapers at that time could really be only afforded by the very affluent upper class. With the Industrial Revolution, however, and the increasing technology for printing that we discussed in our chapter about books, the improved printing allowed newspapers to be printed at a lower cost. It also increased literacy of the middle class. And so 4,000 papers could be printed per hour. It made them cheaper to produce. And that's how we get penny papers. Penny papers were a penny. They cost a penny when they came out. And so they became more affordable for the everyday person. While there were some subscriptions to the penny press, it was mainly known for street sales. Extra, extra, read all about it. The newsboys that would stand on the street and shout the day's headlines to get someone to pick up a paper were really some of the greatest advocates for American journalism, because it allowed for an era of newspapers as a mass medium that wasn't just for the elite class, it was also for the everyday man. Now, in 1833, we have the New York Sun. Its motto was, "It shines for all." Benjamin Day was its publisher, and it didn't have any subscriptions. It was one of the first American newspapers that did not require subscription. You could buy it for a penny. The stories that appeared in the New York Sun were local. They focused on scandals or things that were of entertaining interest, and a lot of police reports and crime. The New York Sun also included serialized stories, or stories that would appear in segments or various articles over time about celebrities like Davy Crockett and Daniel Boone. They also included a lot of human interest stories, daily trials, ordinary people who had some extraordinary circumstance happen to them. And it's really the kind of local journalism that we see being pushed out now. In just 6 months of it being published, the circulation of the New York Sun was over 8,000, which was twice its largest competitor. The only problem with the New York Sun, they tended to make up a lot of stories because of their focus on sensationalism. So we don't really have the true objectivity and elite journalism that we would hope for. In fact, here's one of their made-up stories. It's an infamous story in American journalism history called "The Inhabitants of the Moon." The New York Sun made up a doctor who was working with a very well-known astronomer at the time, and they were claiming that this doctor had found life on the moon. And so they were documenting all of the various villages on the moon, the types of people that lived there, the culture of the moon. And of course, this was all made up. In 1835, we have the New York Herald. James Gordon Bennett became the first U.S. press baron. He freed journalism from political parties and focused more on the middle and working class readers. They had many different beats, but because of their focus on the middle and working class, they tended to focus on crime, political essays, scandals, business sections. They started to include letters sections, so letters to the editor and other types of community journalism. They had beats about fashion, sports, religion, society gossip, and of course, once the Civil War hit, that became a major story for the newspaper as well. By 1860, they had a circulation of nearly 80,000, and so it was, of course, the largest daily at the time. Now, as mass media continued to emerge, it shifted the economic base of newspapers to advertising. There were a lot of newspapers that were placing ads disguised as consumer news. And so the newspaper had to be very neutral towards advertisers, and they would print almost anything. If you would pay them to put an ad in the paper, it would appear. By 1848, there were 6 papers that formed the Associated Press, which became a very large part of American journalism. The Associated Press is still in existence today, and they provide access to stories through a newswire service. The original Associated Press relayed stories rapidly via telegraph, and so they would send reporters to different areas like Washington or sites of the Civil War, and those reporters would file their reports by telegraph, and then the Associated Press would send out that one story to a bunch of papers so that all of these papers had access to national news. The Associated Press is, of course, still in existence, although they don't use telegraphs, shocking. But you can see how it worked here in this image. You have a reporter sitting on the right, reporting using a telegraph. And it was really the true emergence of newspapers as mass media. Now, Pulitzer was a very famous newspaper publisher. He published the New York World. Pulitzer and the New York World focused on plain writing style, which was very widely adopted in American journalism. But they were one of the first to include maps and illustrations within their work. They focused heavily on crime and sex, but they realized that women who stayed at home could be a large form of readership, and so they included advice in women's pages. Most of the advertisers for New York World were department stores who were seeking to target those stay-at-home women. But they had a contradictory spirit. Pulitzer prided himself on his reporters covering social causes and uncovering corruption. However, there were still many manufactured stories and, in fact, staged stunts. So Nellie Bly, who is the woman pictured in this newspaper article, was one of their reporters, which, of course, having a female reporter at the time was unheard of. But they produced this stunt where she traveled around the world faster than Jules Verne and would report on all of her different journeys in the paper. Now, of course, you probably recognize the name Pulitzer from the Pulitzer Prize, which is awarded for journalism, literature, drama, and music. And Pulitzer also created a graduate school of journalism at Columbia University. Now, his competitor Hearst, who is also well known within the journalism industry, created the paper The New York Journal. Hearst was very sneaky and went and hired many members of Pulitzer's staff to start his own paper. In fact, he even hired gangsters to deliver paper to make sure that the readership would pay out. The New York Journal was known for sensational stories, but it would appeal to immigrants by using large headlines and bold layouts that were easy to read and easy to take in. They were very well known, however, for inventing interviews, faking pictures, and encouraging conflicts. In fact, Hearst once said, "The modern editor does not care about the facts, the editor wants novelty." Hearst was the model for Charles Foster Kane in the movie Citizen Kane. And that is a wonderful movie, classic movie about American journalism that if you haven't seen, you should. Hearst became one of the largest media businesses in the world. By 1930, they owned 40 daily and Sunday papers. They owned 13 magazines, 8 radio stations, and 2 film companies, including Good Housekeeping, Cosmopolitan, and many of the large papers. In fact, Hearst is still a company. They own one of the TV stations here in Birmingham, and they are a large media conglomerate. Now, modern journalism really was driven in the late 1800s. There was a real dichotomy between story-driven news, which was yellow and penny press, where it really didn't matter what the facts were. It was all about entertainment, versus the objective, just the facts type of reporting. So a lot of work went into understanding the need for objectivity within journalism and how that would be created. Well, the New York Times was a major influencer in that. Adolph Ochs in 1896 began the New York Times. He wanted it to be a no frills paper. It was meant to be informational, just the facts, ma'am. And they appealed to the affluent and educated people again. In 1989, he lowered the price down to a penny, and circulation boomed and made it one of the most popular papers in America. The objective modern journalist was known for the inverted pyramid style. It was so popular because it allowed editors to cut at each of those lines if there wasn't enough space in the layout of the publication to allow for additional room. And it also made it very easy for reporters to go out and know how to write the story. However, the problem is that many journalists criticized the inverted pyramid style and continue to do so for being too cookie cutter. It's kind of copy and paste journalism, and it lacks kind of the art of writing that the early American journalist had. However, the inverted pyramid style is still the preferred method of writing, particularly for print media. And so it is important that you recognize that a lot of that came from the 1800s and the New York Times style writing. Now, after World War I, we start getting more into interpretive journalism, which explains key issues within a historical and social context. Walter Lippmann suggests that there are three responsibilities of the press: to make a record of what's going on in our lives, to analyze it and provide understanding for it, and then basing their information off of their analysis and the current record, journalists should then suggest plans for how to make it better. And so this argument about whether journalists should just report the news as straight facts or be able to provide editorial opinion really came to a head with the 1930s, with the Depression and threats from the Nazis. And so political columns and op-eds became very popular during this time because journalists were really seeking to extend their role to analysis. This also really inspired a lot of radio analysis that kind of grew the industry. It used to be at the beginning of the 1930s, and even prior to that, radio host would actually sit down and just read straight from a newspaper for their facts. And newspapers often sued radio stations for just reading their information and stealing their profits. But it paved the way for radio announcers to become analysts of the news that they were reading. And it is kind of how the talking head analysis that we know today on cable, radio talk shows, podcasts, political shows, that was really the birth of that movement. Literary journalism became a lot more popular in the 1960s. This is also known as new journalism, and it uses the techniques of creative writing or fiction writing and using it for reporting. So it mixes content and form similar to Mark Twain's writing in the 19th century. If you've ever read a Rolling Stones article, you know, it uses a lot of narrative. It a lot of descriptors, opinions, you know, things like that. So it allows for longer features, especially for cultural and social issues, which is why, of course, in the 1960s, it became a lot more popular. There was an attack on objectivity in 1960 as people were realizing that there is no one truth in life, that people can have many different opinions and all still be correct. And so you can't see just one fact. You really have to be able to take in all sides, and journalists really weren't doing that prior to the 1960s. Journalists were also relying very heavily on sources of power, such as the president or other government officials. And so advocacy journalism was really born in an effort to become a watchdog of cultural and social issues, such as racism or women's equality, things like that. Precision journalism was also heavily used in the 1960s. This is the use of scientifically accurate information to tell stories, such as data journalism, polls, questionnaires, resource reporting during elections, things of that nature. I'm sure you've seen a lot of it during COVID-19. So data journalism really grew in the 1960s as a reaction to objectivity not being as heavily bought into in the field anymore. Now, online journalism, of course, has changed the game for print newspapers. The Drudge Report was a major influence in online journalism. It really breaks journalists from that front page mindset and forces them to think about journalism in new ways. And we will, of course, discuss digital journalism in future lessons, but it's important to realize that the real grandfather of digital journalism was newspapers. And it was really a lot of these particular events like the BP oil spill or Occupy Wall Street that gave birth to the digital newspaper online journalism movement. So now that you understand a little bit about the history of newspapers, I want you to discuss newspaper readership. Make sure you watch the video on modern journalism business models, have a discussion on news deserts. We will have a guest speaker who has worked in the newspaper and digital media industry, so she can provide some good insight for us. And then I want you to read chapter 9 on magazines for next week's lesson.